The law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. This quote from Anatole France poses an interesting question. What does the neutral application of the law mean if the law itself is not neutral? What does equality under the law mean if the law itself is designed to uphold inequalities? This is the Still Spying podcast, a limited edition podcast focusing on FBI surveillance. I'm Chip Gibbons, Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent. I'm also a journalist and researcher who has published articles about FBI abuses of power for The Intercept, Indies Times, Jacobin, The Nation, and Washington Post. In the last two episodes, we've explored the history of the FBI, the history of the FBI's continuous practice of political surveillance, as well as the history of efforts to reform the FBI, at least as it pertains to its political surveillance. We've heard from our guests and had conversations about the distinction between law enforcement and intelligence and what that means for political policing and political surveillance. Now, some people might argue that the type of political surveillance the FBI engages in is an excess, it's a mistake, it's a mission creep, it's the FBI stemming from its missions, it's sort of a rogue tendency. I, on the other hand, would argue that political policing is not a bug, but a feature. After all, it isn't just the FBI that engages in political policing. Local police as well have historically, since the late 19th century, had at times things called red squads. Those are domestic intelligence units explicitly to go after Reds, i.e. labor agitators, socialist, communist, anarchist, and in later years, racial justice activists. This experience is in no way unique to the United States. In other countries, including other liberal democracies, domestic intelligence has also gone into the realm of political policing, targeting rather similar groups of people. So, what does this mean? It means in the United States, I would say, there was some degree of consensus that certain political movements and ideas were dangerous. These were the labor movements, the anti-capitalist movements, and the racial justice movements, and they had to be stopped. You know, we heard about COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, per the Church Committee, was a domestic covert operation to uphold the status quo. And Frank Donner, who wrote the landmark study of local police red squads, called his book Protectors of Privilege. Clearly he viewed the red squads as being in the role of protecting the privileged classes in their political policing. But what about regular policing? Does it defend the status quo? Does it protect privilege? These days, with the uprisings in response to the police murder of George Floyd, we're hearing more and more about police abolitionists. They argue that policing does not solve the problems it purports to deal with, and in many cases, they question the origins of policing itself. Some activists may cite reference to the legacy of slave catchers, whereas other activists and scholars go a little bit further back and point out how the first modern police forces arose to deal specifically with the industrial working class and were very much designed to enforce class relations. Enforcing class relations, enforcing white supremacy, these are clearly political projects. Now, I'm not asking you to accept the claims of police abolitionists. This is not a polemical diatribe on my part, but this discussion is happening right now, and I think it's interesting to talk to people who think that the police itself are political to figure out where does political policing fit into that. Later in this show, I'll be joined by Alex Vitale, a very noted police abolitionist, although I will warn you that the interview with Alex was recorded before the uprisings in response to George Floyd's death. For this conversation to gotten even mainstream. Even then, we felt like when we set out to do this podcast that we had to talk to police abolitionists and hear this perspective and think about how the struggle against political policing plays into this. Now, you might be saying, what do you mean all policing is political? What about crime? After all, aren't there criminals in the world? Aren't the police there to stop them? So many of the abolitionists, and Alex will explain this better than I can, would argue that policing actually fails to address the social harms that cause crime as well as the social harms caused by crime. They don't deal with the harm that drug addiction does. They also don't address the reasons why people might turn to drug addiction. There's not actually less drug addiction and destitution in the world because we're aggressively policing it. I think we can all agree on that. But then let's go a step further. What about crime itself? What about that as a category? I want to turn to a book called Golden Gulag, Prison, Surplus Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California. It's written by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a noted academic and prison abolitionist, which is very similar to police abolitionism and closely related in some respects. Here's what she says about this question in the context of prisons. But what about crime? Doesn't prison exist because there are criminals? Yes and no. While common sense suggests a natural connection between crime and prison, what counts as crime in fact changes. What happens to people convicted of crimes does not, in all times and places, result in prison sentences. Defined in the simple terms of the secular state, crime means a violation of the law. Laws change, depending on what in a social order counts as stability and who in a social order needs to be controlled. Let's look at a range of examples. After the Civil War, an onslaught of legal maneuvers designed to guarantee cheap availability of Southern black people's labor outlawed both moving around and standing still, and convicts worked without choice or compensation to build the region's infrastructure and industrial system. From the 1890s onwards, a rush of Jim Crow laws both fed on earlier forced labor statutes and sparked the nationwide apartheid craze. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919 prohibited the manufacture, import, export, or sale of intoxicating liquors at a time when most drugs that are now illegal were not. In Texas, driving while drinking alcohol is legal, whereas a marijuana seed can put a person in prison for life. Prostitution is legal in some places. In others, the remedy for theft is restitution, not a cage. Murder is the result of opportunity, motive, and means, and the fact of a killing begins rather than ends an inquiry into shifting legal natures of such a loss. Numerous historians and criminological treatises show shifts over time in what crime is and why it matters. Contemporary studies demonstrate how societies that are relatively similar, industrialized, diverse, largely immigrant, differ widely in their assessment and experiences of disorderly behavior and the remedies of what's generally accepted as wrong. As we can see that crime is not fixed, it follows that crime's relationships to prisons is the outcome of social theory and practice rather than the only possible source of stability through control. Let me give you an example about malleability of law. Theft, after all, is generally illegal in all societies, or it has been for a long time. But let's take a look at the United Kingdom's so-called Bloody Code. In 1688, there were 50 offenses on the statute book that were punishable by death. But that number had quadrupled by 1776, and by the end of the century it was 220 crimes that were punishable by death. Most of those crimes were property crimes pertaining to theft. But if theft had always been punishable by death in England, as it had at this time, why then were there so many new crimes about theft? Well, it's very simple. Theft was not a fixed category. As class relations changed with the enclosure of once public lands being privatized and the rise of an industrial working class, the definition of property, the definition of theft, they began to shift. That's part of the reason. Douglas Hay, a legal historian who has written about this period, reflected on it. Criminal law is as concerned with authority as property, for wealth does not exist outside a social context. Theft is given definition only within a set of social relations, and the connections between property, power, and authority are crucial. Critical legal theorist and Harvard Law professor Duncan Kennedy had something similar and interesting to say about our own times. When talking about the power of the law, he said, "All kinds of people of higher social classes are constantly dunning and drilling into the heads of people of lower social classes than their own, that all kinds of things the people at the bottom want can't be had because they're illegal. The idea of the legal and the illegal is something which you can exercise great power with over people who believe in it. Some of you listening right now might be nodding your heads in agreement. Others of you might be shaking your heads in disagreement, saying, Chip, who is this list of radicals and malcontents you're quoting from? Well, let's look at a different perspective, a perspective from people who are fairly pro-policing. You may have heard the phrase broken windows. It is widely criticized today as sort of causing sort of the problems with over-policing and over-criminalization we see today. It was very influential in New York in the 90s and other cities, where police started not focusing so much on violent crimes, but trying to prevent crime by cracking down on low-level offenses, like the squeegee men in New York, people who would come and try to clean your windshield wiper, or vagrants, or truants, or sex workers. The phrase broken windows in this context comes in part from a 1982 Atlantic article written by two proponents of this type of policing, George L. Kelly and James Q. Wilson. I find it very fascinating to read this article in light of all of the debates about policing. For example, they argue in the article that policing had undergone a shift over time. Remember, they're writing in 1982. They argued early police focused on order, not law enforcement. But since then, policing had begun to focus more and more on law enforcement and less on order. They argued that people weren't just afraid of violent crime, but what they were also afraid of was disorderly people, and that when you criminalized quote-unquote harmless crimes like public drunkenness or sex work, you were therefore giving the police no tools to deal with these disorderly people. They talked about policing in the early days of the nation. They said, from the earliest days of the nation, the police function was seen primarily that of a night watchman, to maintain order against the chief threat to order, fire, wild animals, and disreputable people. Solving crime was viewed not as a police responsibility, but a private one. I would also note the way they viewed civil liberties and civil rights during this time period. They said, the police in this earlier period assisted in that restoration of authority by acting sometimes violently on behalf of the community. Young toughs were roughed up, people were arrested on suspicion or for vagrancy, and prostitutes and petty thieves were routed. Rights, in quotation marks, were something enjoyed by decent folk, and perhaps also by the serious professional criminal who avoided violence and could afford a lawyer. This pattern of policing was not an aberration or the result of an occasional excess. They claimed it was rooted in the night watchman function. So this is talking about police as maintaining order. And doesn't that view of the police as coming for disreputable people, maintaining order, is that so far divorced from how police abolitionists view police? I don't know if Kelly and Wilson have since changed their views. And maybe I'm trolling you a little bit by bringing out their own words and arguing that they're very similar to those of police abolitionists. But in both cases, the argument is that police maintain social order. From those who are critical of the prevailing social order, that bodes negatively for police. For those who wish to uphold it, obviously there's a different calculation, but there is an overlap in how we view police. So this takes me back to my initial opening, where I talked about how political policing was about maintaining the status quo, about protecting the privileged. If policing is also, regular policing, about maintaining the social order in general, how then can we understand political policing in this larger framework? For this question, I now turn to my friend, Alex Vitale. So this week we're joined by Alex Vitale. Alex is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Police and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He has spent the last 25 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. He is also the author of The End of Policing. Thank you for joining us today, Alex.
You bet, Chip.
So we've been talking about on this podcast the issue of how the FBI serves as sort of a political police or engages in political surveillance. You come from sort of a different perspective than our previous couple of guests in that you are a police abolitionist, which I'll dig into more in a little bit. When we were on a panel together in New York, you said something that was very interesting to me, which is that all policing is political. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so, in standard kind of liberal narrative about policing, liberal like academic narrative about policing, there's always this big divide between high policing and low policing. And what they mean by that is, well, there's normal everyday policing, which of course is about fighting crime. And then there's this little side thing, which is the police infiltrating and surveilling political organizations at the behest of the government in some way. And so all of this is an attempt to preserve this myth that there is this law enforcement function, crime control function of policing that somehow is apolitical, is divorced from politics. And so this is really a misunderstanding of the nature of police power. So on the one hand, all policing includes this high policing function, and that high policing was always a central motivator for the creation of policing. And in fact, the earlier words, usage of the word policing attached to things like the French secret police, that it was secret policing that came first. So there's a mistake to imagine that there's policing without high policing. At the same time, there's a mistake to think that everyday policing is somehow apolitical, that in fact, the decision to charge the police with the management of certain kinds of behavior is always a political decision. And we can see this most clearly at the margins, which is why have we turned certain kinds of problems into policeable problems? So, for instance, in Portugal, they've largely removed the police from the drug question and handed it over to the public health department. That's a political decision. The reverse of that was, why did the Nixon administration make the decision to turn drugs into a federal law enforcement issue? Because before that, there wasn't a major focus on drugs for federal law enforcement. It was a state issue. Anslinger, these folks were doing drug war stuff, but it was amped up in a completely different way, not because of a crime or public health issue, but because of a cynical kind of politics around race, the Southern strategy of appealing to white, historically Democratic voters in the South to get them to move to the Republican Party in the wake of desegregation and the civil rights movement. So all decisions to turn something over to the police are political decisions. And we can see this right now with the COVID situation. We've got police in too many places out enforcing social distancing measures. And often this is presented to us as, well, who else would do it? The police is the only agency that we have that can go out and interact with people. But this is a mistake. We could treat this as a public health problem. We could empower a public health infrastructure. We could get community leaders involved, and we could manage social distancing in a different way. So really, all policing is the result of a set of political decisions. And that when we talk about police accountability, for instance, we make the mistake of assuming that the legal and operational frameworks within which the police are operating are somehow given, natural, unquestioning, and that when there's a problem with policing, it's because some officer didn't follow those legal and procedural guidelines properly, and that if we discipline them or threaten them with discipline, that they will then follow those things properly and everything will be okay. But that never allows us to interrogate the legal and procedural frameworks that have been put in place, which by their very nature may be incredibly harmful.
Sure. So you're a police abolitionist. Some people listening to this who have never heard of that perspective before might think that's like really far out there. And how could you advocate that? Could you explain what is police abolitionism and why you advocate for it?
So there are different arguments about this, and there are different sort of tendencies within it. I've sort of associated myself with a kind of almost a justice reinvestment style of this, which is to say that since we understand policing as a political decision, is it really the best decision in any given circumstance? And part of what influences that decision is a deeper understanding of the functional nature of policing. It is inherently coercive and racially discriminatory. So that when we turn a problem over to police, it automatically and inherently comes with a lot of negative consequences: corruption, violence, abuse, racism, etc. And this does not require that any individual officer be motivated by personal racism, though that is a problem. So once we understand that, then we see the limits to a whole set of procedural reforms, like I mentioned before: accountability measures, training, body cameras, that these things are designed not to address the substantive harms that are inherent to policing. They're designed to paper over them, to give the appearance that policing can be done in a non-harmful way, to win back the trust of the community in the way that community policing attempts to do so. But that community policing is in fact inherently problematic, because what it rests on is the idea that the community brings their problems to the police to solve, and then they work together out of mutual respect to solve them. But what tools do the police have to solve our community problems? Guns and handcuffs and ticket books and threats and coercion. They don't have affordable housing. They don't have high quality mental health care services. They don't have drug treatment programs, right? These are the kind, they don't have summer jobs. They don't have, runaway services for runaway youth, whatever the problem is. So an abolitionist says, rather than investing our political capital in a set of reforms to re-legitimate an institution that's inherently harmful, we should demand solutions to our problems that don't rely on that coercive apparatus. So we should always look for those non-punitive, non-carceral, non-injurious strategies. So I always say, show me a problem in the community, because this is not about denying that communities have problems. Communities have problems. Show me the problem, and then let's figure out a solution where we put every possible option on the table. And we should have some criteria for judging this. The choices that we make, they should have some metric of effectiveness, not simplistic, certain kinds of quantitative research, whatever. But we should have some reason to think they're effective. It should be done efficiently, cost effectively, and it should treat people with as much humanity and dignity as possible. And of course, policing fails generally on all three of these measures. So an abolitionist is not saying, well, tomorrow we flip a switch and there are no police, at least none of the ones that I work with. They're saying, in every instance, what can we do to reduce our reliance on policing and develop alternatives that are more life-affirming, that build people up instead of tearing them down? And as we pursue concrete programs to do that, we diminish police power while making communities and individuals stronger and more resilient. We don't need school police to be better trained. We don't need them to be friendlier. We don't need them to be mentors to our children. We need to get rid of school policing altogether, put in more counselors, better after-school activities, more aides in the classrooms, establish restorative justice mechanisms for discipline. We don't need narcotics officers to get anti-bias training. We need to end the war on drugs, treat it as a public health and economic development problem, and address it in those ways.
So one of the things I've heard you speak about when you've talked about police abolition before is sort of the origins of modern policing and how it's tied to what you label regimes of accumulation, regimes of exploitation. I think that's a perspective a lot of listeners might not have heard. Could you go into that a little bit?
Sure. So again, we have this liberal narrative about policing that says, the police were this progressive alternative to relying on the military or militias or informal watches to manage crime. But that liberal analysis leaves out a huge amount of both history and sort of the actual functional nature of policing. So the liberal narrative of policing always begins with the formation of the London Metropolitan Police in 1829, created by Sir Robert Peel, Robert, Bob, the Bobbies. And everyone celebrates the Peelian principles of policing by consent and how it was less aggressive and invasive and illegitimate than, relying on the militia to shoot at disorderly crowds. But what gets left out of that narrative is where Peel got this idea from. In fact, his previous job was as he was in charge of the English occupation of Ireland. And policing emerges for him as a tool of colonial management. And this is true throughout the history of policing, that policing develops in relationship to the management of the consequences of regimes of exploitation. That when regimes of exploitation are put in place, people resist them. There are contradictions that emerge as social problems, in quotes, and policing is needed to manage that in a more legitimate, less violent, and less politically threatening way. And when policing emerges around the world in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, it typically emerges in relationship to the three dominant forms of exploitation during that period, which are slavery, colonialism, and the management of a rapidly expanding industrial workforce. So that is always the regime of those are the regimes of exploitation that produce the social conditions that police are being asked to manage. The prevention of slave revolts, the prevention of anti-colonial uprisings, the prevention, the management of strikes and working class disorderly behavior, etc. So in the book, The End of Policing, I track this out in a number of different places. I talk about the Texas Rangers as a form of colonial policing, and also the interaction between these different forms. We've got a growing body of research about the connection between domestic policing and international military and colonial activity. So Stuart Schrader's book, Badges Without Borders, talks about the interchange of ideas between, our military efforts and counterinsurgency efforts in South Vietnam and the reshaping of American policing, and how, in fact, this was a entirely two-way exchange. Similarly, I just finished reading an article by Julian Go, who's a scholar of post-colonial studies and sociology, who shows how post-colonial or how colonial logics that developed during like the US occupation of the Philippines then feed back into the logic of American policing. And there's a direct correspondence of personnel and technology that's moving back and forth between colonial projects and domestic policing projects.
So if domestic policing is rooted in these sorts of regimes of exploitation, such as managing sort of industrial labor strife, how then does political policing factor into this? Should we think of political policing as a separate thing, or is it just policing in general?
Exactly. So that's sort of my point, right? Is that what appears to be apolitical policing, such as something like broken windows policing. Oh, well, we don't want, homeless people bothering us as we walk down the street. We don't want to see squeegee men. We don't want to allow street level drug dealing. Well, that's treated as if it's apolitical. But in fact, these are all symptoms of a regime of exploitation. Now, we don't have slavery and colonialism, and we barely have industrialization in the US anymore. What we have is this kind of neoliberal economic program that concentrates wealth among a very few international players and then creates a massive service economy and a massive economy of folks who are under and unemployed, living in very marginal circumstances. And that produces mass homelessness, untreated mental illness, mass involvement in black market activity like drugs and sex work, et cetera. And that's what police do every day, is manage exactly those problems. They are not out chasing bank robbers. They are managing the symptoms of a neoliberal austerity politics and economics. And so that is inherently a political project. High policing is just the subset of that, where the symptoms are organized resistance. And everyday policing is basically managing the disorganized symptoms of those systems of exploitation.
So then, in your opinion, does it make sense to draw a distinction between something like the local Red Squad or the FBI's COINTEL program or the FBI spy on Occupy Wall Street and treating that as sort of its own category separate from what you were calling low policing?
Well, I think we can understand them as analytically distinct, just like vice units and narcotics units have, and anti-gang units and gun suppression. They have their own particular dynamics, and we can reduce their power and influence in important ways, but our analysis needs to extend beyond that, so that we don't make the mistake, for instance, of engaging in superficial reformism that doesn't really get more deeply to the heart of the matter. And too often, this involves letting politicians off the hook. That what happens is that our analysis stops at the level of the police chief or the police commissioner, and we go and we yell at the police chief and the police commissioner as if they develop these policies sui generis on their own, independently. But the police did not create the war on drugs. They did not create the Red Scares. They did not, dream up the Palmer raids. These are political projects designed to solve political problems, and therefore they must be dealt with at the level of political accountability.
So in our report, the big recommendation that we have is to enact a legislative charter on the FBI. A lot of people don't know this, but the FBI in addition to being a law enforcement agency, it's self-fashioned as an intelligence agency, and unlike the CIA or the NSA, it has literally no congressional charter outlining what it can do and what it can't do. And historically, efforts to reform the FBI have focused on sort of limiting it to investigating violations of the federal criminal code and sort of keep it away from these sorts of open-ended quote-unquote intelligence investigations. Do you think reforms like that are meaningful or not?
So to get where we want to go, we have to build political power. And that is something that we have to feel our way forward in doing that. So we often undertake campaigns that we see as stepping stones or as developmental. The challenge is to figure out those reforms that are non-reformist reforms, as a number of folks talk about, so that we want to be careful that we don't pursue strategies that ultimately serve the purpose of relegitimating the institution it is that we want to see disempowered, that we don't just shine up their image and allow them to say, well, we fixed that problem, now we can get back to job number one without all this baggage. Oh, well, we got rid of the racists. We did some implicit bias training, so we're all good now. So does a charter shine up their image, enhance their legitimacy, or does it set very concrete constraints on the scope and depth of their power and authority? That would be the question that I would use to help guide an assessment of that strategy. And I would also just ask myself and the movement, are there other intermediate steps that we could take that would concretely reduce their scope and power and question their fundamental legitimacy? So one of the interesting, movements that we've seen pop up recently is getting local governments to reject participation in these joint task forces of various kinds. The JTTF task forces. I'm involved in
Joint
an
terrorism
effort.
task
Yeah,
force.
joint terrorism task forces. I'm involved in an effort now in a handful of cities that have been targeted by the Justice Department under Operation Relentless Pursuit. This is the Trump administration and Barr's effort to mobilize federal law enforcement in partnership with local police to go after, the super bad guys in 7 major cities. So in places like Cleveland and Detroit and Albuquerque, people are now organizing to get their local government to reject this new money and these partnerships. And that organizing takes the form of saying, we view the use of federal law enforcement to serve this purpose as fundamentally misguided, as unjust. And that directly limits their scope of power.
I mean, but with the Terrorism Task Force, I mean, one of the frequent criticisms is that the guidelines the FBI operates under are so significantly looser than most local police guidelines that the police are oftentimes violating local law by being in the JTTF to begin with.
So I think this is a bit of a short-sighted strategy because it looks too much like a set of procedural reforms. And I think there needs to be more focus on the harms concretely, that even when these task forces operate as they are, quote, supposed to, it is still producing unnecessary harms. That, I think, is the way we should frame these things. So, for instance, in the work we're doing in Cleveland and Detroit, we're trying to articulate, and the local, activists there are trying to articulate concretely why they don't want the problems that they face in those cities addressed as law enforcement problems, period. Why is it that when there's youth violence, this is immediately treated as the solution being more police and incarceration, instead of saying, where are the community resources? Where are the community-based anti-violence interrupters? Where are the youth jobs? Where's the path forward for young people in this community? Rather than saying, oh, well, the DEA doesn't use body cameras, therefore we can't work with them. To me, I'm not interested in that strategy.
So it sort of reminds me of what a friend of mine always says, that he sort of criticizes people for assuming that groups or individuals they're criticizing, to put it quite simply, are bad at good things as opposed to good at bad things. And that sort of gets into the question of what is the fundamental nature of the police, or what is the fundamental nature of the intelligence services. I know in my line of work, I focus sort of more on the intelligence aspects of things, and there's this sort of ability to treat the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, etc., as being these sorts of necessary tools, just intended to keep the average citizen safe from some sort of external harm. And they just have mission creep, or they lose sight of their principles. And that's why they sort of, keep overthrowing democratically elected governments in Latin America, or spying on racial justice groups. It's just sort of getting away from their true purpose. That is that they're bad at good things. But I think when you go back and look at sort of the origins of these different entities, when you look at sort of the situations they're designed to treat, I think domestic intelligence, much like domestic policing, is very much tied to sort of originally managing labor strife. You have things like the Pinkerton detectives, private detectives that are out there breaking up strikes. Early domestic intelligence units are very appropriately called red squads. The history is similar in other countries as well. So there's very much the possibility that they actually are good at bad things when they do these things. Although, of course, when it comes to our friends in intelligence, they're also bad at bad things.
I was going to say they're bad at bad things too.
They're bad at bad,
this thing in Venezuela the other day.
Yes. Well, by the time this interview comes out, it will not be just the other day, but that is a real example of being bad at bad things. And the firm that is behind the sort of coup attempt in Venezuela, you will get a kick out of this, Alex. I don't know if you saw what their original purpose was. It was to counter school shootings by putting armed ex-Green Berets in schools, pretending to be cool shop teachers.
Yes, I think I remember that movement. And yes, that is an incredibly misguided strategy.
Yeah, the one guy did some presentation. I'll pretend to be a cool shop teacher, and I'll see a kid who's playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I'll be like, "What's up with you?" And it's like, "Oh, you are exactly the person we need in our schools, a Green Beret on the lookout for students playing Dungeons and Dragons."
I have a better idea. Why don't we actually hire more cool shop teachers?
That's a good idea. Well, yes, that is a better idea. Thankfully, though, they have branched out into overthrowing socialist Latin American governments, which is, I think, very few other countries besides the United States is putting Green Berets to stop school shootings and toppling South American governments, both potentially viable business models.
I mean, in both cases, right, what we got to ask is politically what's going on, right? So what are the actual political objectives that are being pursued or being enabled by turning a problem over to the FBI? And we've got to deepen our analysis about what these regimes of exploitation are that are being facilitated by these law enforcement entities. And in the case of the FBI, this includes a lot of really bad international behavior around the world designed to prop up a certain kind of model of economic might and economic development that obviously benefits people in different ways and disproportionately, and we've got to criticize that. And when we go after the procedural stuff, it erases all of those harms that are at the root of what they're trying to accomplish.
I mean, with the FBI, since they've lost the power to straight up police, quote unquote, domestic subversives, they've had that power taken away from them. Supposedly that was meant as a reform, but since then they've just used their counterterrorism authorities to accomplish the same ends. And you look at when they spy on these different groups like Occupy Wall Street or School of the Americas Watch, which was a pacifist group that U.S. Latin American policy, they always acknowledge, well, this group is nonviolent, this group is peaceful, whatever. But a lone offender in the future an unknown lone offender in the future could infiltrate this group for an unknown purpose and carry out this sort of unknown act of violence. And you could apply that logic to any group. A chess club could, in theory, be taken over by a disgruntled lone wolf and, I don't know, go out and throw chess pieces at people violently or something. But they don't do that to just any group. And I'm glad they don't do that to any group. I'm not advocating for bulk counterterrorism surveillance, but the groups they repeatedly single out fit a continuous pattern. They're usually anti-war groups, racial justice groups, economic justice groups, or environmental groups. And that was true from the beginning when they were policing domestic subversion as well, like open political policing. Like the whole theory of the COINTELPRO or counterintelligence program was that the activity they were going after was illegal. Hoover thought the Supreme Court had become too liberal and could no longer put communists in jail as a result of it. So they were looking at covert action against lawful speech. In the words of the Church Committee, they were a covert action designed to uphold the domestic status quo. That's the Church Committee's words, not mine. If I said that, people would say I was a crank. If the Church Committee says it, then, it's a little bit more authority. But it's very clear that they think certain points of view are synonymous with terrorism. You have to ask yourself the question, why? Why is it always these groups?
This gets to the heart of the question, right? Sometimes you hear from the procedural reformers, well, we want equity. We want them to also go after the right wing, extremists, and that we want political policing to be politically neutral. And the police will say, well, we restrict permits for all groups. This is not a political decision. This is just about traffic management. But policing is never politically neutral because only certain groups threaten these regimes of accumulation, these regimes of exploitation, and other groups don't. And so they will always partner with right-wing groups whether they're commercial groups like the Pinkertons or informal groups like the American Legion, to out people, to harass people, to surveil people, because they are operating on a certain kind of political worldview that assumes the legitimacy of these regimes of exploitation.
Or you just see them relying on right-wing sources, like in the infamous investigation of opponents of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. The FBI was looking at stuff published by the John Birch Society. I spent half a decade getting the FBI to release its files on this nonviolent Palestine solidarity group called the International Solidarity Movement. And in their predicate for the investigation, they repeatedly cite to a far-right Islamophobic source, and that some of the information in these articles are directly contradicted by the State Department's own human rights reports on the occupied Palestinian territories. And I think a normal person would look at that and say this stuff is nonsense, whereas the FBI was treating it as important factual information to follow up on because it's in line with sort of their worldview.
And this is bipartisan, right? Because let's take the John Birch Society, right? For the Trumpist kind of right-wingers, they are the John Birch Society. So why on earth would they investigate them? But then the old white shoe Republicans, the first George Bush kind of Republicans, their view is, well, John Birch, we don't really disagree with them, but the way they do things is a little distasteful. So, we'll work on that, work with them behind the scenes. But even liberals will say, well, they have a right to their views. And, if the FBI tells us they need to cooperate with them, they're the experts and it's all for, the right reason. And so they never are treated as a threat to the established order and criminalized in the way that left-wing dissent is.
It's also interesting because the FBI did have a counterintelligence program against the Ku Klux Klan, and the origins of that was that the FBI was under a lot of pressure to do something about violence against civil rights workers, and they concluded there was no sort of law enforcement, as in criminal prosecution, response to the Klan because the local police were so deeply in bed with the KKK that it would make prosecutions impossible. So they had to do these sorts of disruptive covert actions. One of the things they did was they had their undercover officers sleep with as many Klan wives as possible in order to break up marriages. But interestingly enough, as the Church Committee noted, the Ku Klux Klan COINTELPRO was the most restrained of any of the COINTEL programs, and explicitly compares it with what they did to the Black Panthers.
And it was pretty short-lived, and it was the result of a kind of direct threat to their institutional legitimacy.
Their informant, the informant they had, gave the FBI advanced knowledge that the Klan was going to attack the Freedom Riders. The Birmingham police had told them they had 15 minutes to beat them up. Then they would come and say, hey, you stop this, real seriously. And the FBI had that advanced knowledge and did nothing about it. Birmingham police, FBI informant, all know the Klan is going to attack Freedom Riders at this time on this date. None of them do anything. I was joined by Alex Vitale. Alex, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I think you have an interesting perspective that people don't hear enough. Thank you for joining us.
I really appreciate it, Chip.